Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this April 2021 webinar for Get in Shape. The purpose of today's webinar and the series of webinars is to help you prepare for, in this stage, the full licensing phase of the Financial Services Legislation Amendment Act, now, of course, the Financial Markets Conduct Act. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome our presenters today. You'll be very familiar with Steve Burgess of Compliance Refinery and also, of course, David Ireland of Denton's Kensington Swan. And they're going to cover really a little bit of an overview of this phase of preparing. So there'll be some callbacks you'll see to some of the webinars that we've had last year. So if you're interested in some of these topics that come up, pop back and see some of the webinars that were recorded last year on the Professional Advice Hub at advice.fsc.org.nz, and you'll be able to dig into those a little bit more deeply. These webinars will now be monthly. So the next one, I think, is scheduled for the 25th of June at Friday at 9:30. There'll be Friday at 9:30 each week, each month rather. And as usual, if you have questions during the webinar, please pop them into Q&A. I'll be monitoring Q&A while the two legends are doing the smart work, and I'll pop the questions across as they come and as they're appropriate onto the speakers so that they can answer the questions for you. So without further ado, welcome, gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate your time, and I'll look forward to hearing today's material.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here as always, and great to be here with David as well. We'll jump in. The format we'll go through is I'll generally introduce the topic and talk for a couple of minutes on each slide, and then David can jump in after with some of the more technical pieces and or to answer any questions you have. If you do have any questions, feel free to throw them into the Q&A. And one of the three of us will get to them, or Mark might ask if David or I missed them. So if we can pop over to the first slide. The standard conditions as you move into licensing, at this point, I would guess most of you are very familiar with them. The top two have maintained since the transitional period, record keeping and the complaints process. Added to that is regulatory returns, which we just had a conversation about. We don't expect any regulatory returns to come out, potentially even out to 2025, depending on how the FMA approaches them. But at the moment, the FMA hasn't communicated any specific dates for regulatory returns that they know of. So as directors of FAPS, what most of you will get is numerous emails coming your way and reminders to complete and finish the regulatory returns. And from time to time, the FMA might do a thematic review. So you should definitely be reviewing all the emails you get in terms of completing those. And then there's outsourcing has been added. This is something that's quite important. The FMA wants to know and understand that you A, have contracts in place, and B, have done some due diligence on any of your partners, including compliance companies, similar to Compliance Refinery. We think it's really important that you know what governance and what protections you have in place, what the competence is of the companies you're working with. And I think you see that quite a bit right now, like from a privacy perspective, from a BCP perspective, and from a data perspective, how is your client's information protected, which is something that we're all experiencing at the moment. We have business continuity and technology systems. That has grown quite a bit in the transitional period. They added a fair bit in that area around technology systems and cybersecurity. This is an area in the industry that as we work with businesses, we see significant variances. Some do it quite well and some just are at an inadequate standard, quite frankly. Some of the main things I think you should be maintaining in that area is obviously you should have a policy that clearly outlines what your expectations are for not only you, but everybody in your business, and what technologies, what systems people in your business are using is ever so important right now. Businesses should be considering cyber audits, very important. You should have some type of policy in case there is a potential threat. What do advisors or support staff in your business do? You should certainly be on professional systems. You shouldn't be using personal email, those types of things. those are a number of things we see. Cyber audits we consider approaching minimum standard, and all businesses should have a cyber audit to make sure that that the technology and the systems they're using are adequately protecting client data. Like I said, that's probably the biggest area where we see issues. One suggestion in that space is you'll often have a policy document and then you'll have an IT provider. Make sure your policy, you're speaking to your IT provider about your policy. We'd encourage you to have them renew your policy and for it to be very specific. We work with some firms who have their IT provider actually has a policy for them to follow. So it's just redundant having the two policies, but make sure that you are integrating that with your provider. And then you've got ongoing requirements and notification of material changes. Those are going to be relatively specific and simple for your business and mostly from a governance perspective. Obviously that you're fit and proper in that space, and notification of material changes. If you are changing your business model, you have to make sure that you notify the FMA. So that's just a quick run through. I was going to talk a little bit more about record keeping. In regards to record keeping, that's something we've had in the process for a while. Think about it from a bigger perspective. How's your disclosure impacted? How are your business processes? How are your important documents in your business managed? And is that reflected in your record keeping policy? I'll throw over to David now and let him chime in.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's great outline overview of it. And one of the things we have had, I guess, a number of clients talking to us about saying, well, I'm a transitional licensee, therefore the standard conditions for a full license, they don't really apply to me. I've just got the first two conditions. That's all I'm going to focus on, right? And they're really important, record keeping and internal complaints. And record keeping is absolutely fundamental. If you haven't got a record of it, it didn't happen. As far as, say, FMA monitoring, etc., is concerned, you need to prove what you're doing and have one of the key to succeeding in the new environment is the quality of your record keeping and the way you're going about that. However, the fact that the remaining conditions, in particular 4 to 7, don't currently apply to you does not mean that they are not relevant, right? They're just things that you will need to prove and work through when you get your full license with the FMA. But let's say fundamentals or what is expected of you to demonstrate the way you're going about outsourcing and business continuity and technology systems in particular are absolutely relevant now, even as a transitional licensee. It's just you're not required to prove it to the FMA. And I think the really helpful thing, I know we're going to look at the licensing guide shortly, Steve, but a really practical thing that people can do now as a transitional licensee is go through the licensing guide around what it's expecting in relation to your outsourcing and in relation to your business continuity, and actually make sure you've got that nailed and embedded in your systems, in your business now, because that's stuff that you do need to have in place that's going to work for your business now if you're going to succeed in the new environment. It also, actually just jumping into it early, gives you a chance to stress test what you're actually doing. So when you come to apply for your full license, you've got confidence that the stuff you got in place does actually work, and gives you a bit more confidence, I think, in applying for your full license. That was all I wanted to say about the standard conditions for now, Steve.
Fantastic. Thanks. And those are quite key points in terms of how you're moving forward. If we move over to the next slide, that introduces the licensing guide, which, as Cardi would say, is the devil is in the details, and David just touched on it. So in terms of your licensing process, you've got the standard conditions, but then you've got the licensing guide as well. And the licensing guide isn't simply dedicated to the standard conditions. It opens up much more thoroughly and provides a lot more detail as you move through. So it touches on the standard conditions, but also adds different areas as well. Competence, compliance assurance, If any of you have nominated reps, that's something that's covered in there in detail. And that's something, obviously, if you have them, the FMA is going to put a lot of scrutiny through the licensing process, conflicts of interest, advice process, code of conduct, and conduct. So the licensing guide is a great resource. You should pick up the licensing guide. It should be kind of your Bible as you move through the process. It's the document that's going to help you mature your application process and make sure that you're communicating in your original application as much information that's relevant to your application that the FMA needs. The FMA will use this to, I guess, assess your original application. And all of the areas in this will be addressed quite significantly through that process. We will talk about competence later. We've got a full slide on competence. But as we go through compliance assurance, you need to be able to communicate to the FMA how, as a director of a business, you are testing your business, how reporting works, how you know that you're doing what you say you're doing. And the guide calls that out specifically. So that's something that's really important for your business to consider. Now, the thing with a lot of these is, and what's really difficult about the guide, is that you can be a one-man band, and then you can be a business with hundreds of advisors as well. So it's a little bit tricky in the sense that you have to build it for the size of your entity and the complexity of your entity. Obviously, if you have nominated, your life is going to be a bit more complex. If you don't, it's going to be a lot simpler. But you have to think about that. Did you have any comments on that, David?
No, and it is as simple as that. It's actually, you've just really got to think about, your business, that complexity, and how you're going to go about it. I think, we just rip through it. It's really important to just tailor what you're doing to the shape of your business. Actually think about just how complex your business is for what you need to do and what you'll need to demonstrate. And I think the licensing guide just provides a fantastic resource. Loved your comment before about this is the Bible for you to follow. There's lots of detail there, and it's something people should be working through now. See, well, this is what FMA expects of us. It's a really helpful business guide, I think, is the way you should be approaching it. And it covers those aspects you've just been talking about, Steve, and more. Back to you.
Yeah, thanks. So as anybody that's on the call that's considering applying, I would say, if you haven't already, download the guide, read the guide, tear the guide apart. If you're confused in any areas, call out for help. It is regulatory documents are not often meant to be read by normal people. So be careful in terms of as you go forward. One of the big things, and we'll touch on this later, is don't say you're going to do things that you don't do. That's really important as you're going through the guide. If there are things you don't do, if there are things you know you are not going to do, think about how that's going to impact your licensing process. And that should also be part of your consideration for your business structure in moving forward. Always think, do you have the skill set? Do you have the will? And are you actually going to do the things you say you're going to do? Because as part of that license, as part of your compliance assurance program, you're going to say that you're going to do various things, and you need to do those things moving forward. So we will touch on a couple areas in here as we move along in the process in this presentation. If we can go to the next.
One of the things actually on the guide, Steve, was just thinking, one of the things that is surprising, I think, when you do work through it, and we're going to come on to policies and processes later, but is just the full extent of the policies and procedures and processes that FMA is expecting you to have in place, that you are then telling them about when you apply for your full license. It's only really when you went through and highlighted them as we're preparing for this, you just see a number of processes and things that you're expected to document, and actually all of them do make sense from a business to demonstrate you can actually deliver on your obligations under the new regime. It all makes sense, but there's quite a lot there. There is a bit of a danger in being swamped by, I guess the enormity of what appears to be expected there. But if you start crunching through it early and just unpick it to say, well, what does this actually mean for my business? What is a relevant process for me to follow? The fact that you need to have a policy to say, talk about the skill set of the directors of your business, and are they sufficiently skilled, capable of running it, does not mean you need to write a book about the policy there. It might be quite a short policy, and short is better than long, because just make sure it actually works for your business, right? So back to you, Steve.
That's a really good point. And I think that's something you touched on, a good point there. And we popped over the other slide, but that's okay. But a lot of these things are really practical things that are important for anybody running a business. Like we're not licensed, Compliance for Funner isn't licensed, but we've got a lot of these things in place because it's a really good business practice. So as you're going through it, and I think for a lot of businesses, they say, okay, this is a big transition from how we operated before, but it's a really good process to go through to set up your governance and understand your governance, your testing, your quality control, and how you work with your customers. It's a great process for anybody running a business. It actually extrapolates well outside of just financial advisors. But moving on, one of the areas that a lot of businesses have just come into is disclosure. We've all had to get the public disclosure up on the 15th on your websites or however you're addressing it. And then one of the things we've kind of heard from a lot of businesses is kind of, oh, thank God that's done. So we just wanted to call out that it isn't actually done. Public disclosure isn't a set and forget. It's not something that you should just sit over there and say, okay, we're done. We'll check on that in a year or two, see how we're going. And one of the things we've been seeing from a lot of businesses is kind of, you've come out of a regime that really like disclosure statements. And largely the FMA and quite frankly, clients, everybody in the industry has largely considered the statements as ineffective in terms of communicating with clients or providing value to clients. And that's why they've changed the regime to put information into the advice process when the client's making decisions and when scopes are being agreed to. It's really important that you consider that, because if you've still got a separate disclosure statement, you still have to integrate that information into your advice process, which actually makes it a little bit trickier. Technically, a disclosure statement doesn't exist anymore. So be very careful if you kind of are one of the groups that either has technology constraints or has just said, oh, we really like the last regime. We kind of want to stay as similar to the past as possible. We would say just cross over the line, go into the new world, forget disclosure statements. From a record keeping perspective, it's a lot easier. In ensuring that clients actually have the information when they're accessing documents is very important. One of the things we've thought about is updating disclosure. So, you're required to provide certain pieces of information to clients at certain points. And this is where it's not set and forget. If you're changing product providers, that could cause you to update. Changing product lines, if you're adding digital advice or different types of advice, like a limited advice in terms of how you interact with clients, those can be instigators. Changes in commission rates, material changes to your business, all things you really have to consider as instigators for updating. And then we get into a little bit more on record keeping, which is surprisingly strong in the disclosure space, because you need to be able to have a version control system. So a lot of businesses don't necessarily have version control systems for any documents, especially smaller businesses. It's not something people inherently think of, but you need to be able to track. These are the different disclosures we've provided over time. And this is when they changed, and this is what the change is. And for those of you with bigger businesses, I know I've worked at a big company and we went through everything and said, oh my God, we've got, people are still using documents from 8 years ago. How are they even getting these documents? So it's really something you need to think of, especially important with disclosure. If somebody's using an old statement of advice and you've changed that disclosure, you can't just go through and kind of just take an old one and start, customizing it to a new client necessarily. You have to make sure that people are using the updated documents. And so in order to do that, you have to have testing, you have to have controls in place. And you also have to have the updated documents easily accessible for them. So that's one of those things. You need to ask yourself, are your systems sufficient to maintain adequate records of your disclosures and to ensure that advisors are actually using those, and support staff in a lot of cases are using them. Any thoughts in that space, David?
Well, I reiterate, I guess, everything you've said. I'm thinking if you go broad, there's a lot of detail in the disclosure obligations, and sometimes, a bit like a lot of this, you can get buried in the detail. I think really important when it comes to disclosure in particular is taking a step back and thinking, what are they actually trying to achieve with the regime? And I think one of the real positives of this, the new environment, is that the MB regulators have tried to design something that sort of makes sense. It's all about helping your clients make fully informed decisions. And so you're moving away from just thrusting a bit of paper at a client, that's something just to get out of the way and then you carry on. But it's actually using your disclosure as an effective tool for your business to help your client understand what you're doing. I think if you look at your disclosure documentation, the process you go through as your friend, as a business tool, it's actually helping you explain your value proposition to the client, helping them understand your business model, then you're a large way towards having a fully compliant business. You don't resist. It's a bit like the tide. You can't keep swimming against it. You just got to flow with it. It's going to work, and it should be your friend. The one I was quite keen to talk about, interested in your thoughts around it, Steve, of what you're seeing and what you're advising some of your clients, is that last bullet point we've got there about disclosure when you're not providing regulated financial advice. I have just provided an information only piece. I've just given some information to a client, and technically, I don't have any disclosure obligation, right? When I'm doing that, information only. My concern is your obligation, record-keeping obligation, to maintain adequate records in relation to your financial advice service sort of goes beyond just when you're giving financial advice, but it is about the overall service. And thinking actually part of that, quite possibly, is giving information to your clients. Your best way of proving that you only gave information, did not actually provide financial advice, is having a record of that, which can mean sort of a disclosure piece or a disclaimer to say, hey, this is just information. I'm not giving you financial advice, and just having that clarity of information that you're going to your client, which just helps demonstrate, verify that you're complying with your obligations and that the information provided was not actually financial advice. Of course, a disclaimer that says, I haven't given you financial advice, when what you've said is, I recommend you should buy a whole lot of shares in Steve Burgess's in the Compliance Refinery, because that's a really good buy at the moment. You've given financial advice. You can't argue that something is not, say that something is not financial advice if it is, just by using a disclaimer. So use it sensibly. But for me, it's all part of giving better quality information to your clients, is actually having some form of a disclosure, standard wording that you use when you are not providing regulated financial advice, so that it's clear to your clients. They have it in front of them. This is not financial advice. They know what you're actually telling them. Any thoughts on that one, Steve?
Yeah. Yes, we have a few. We've worked through this with a couple of groups. It can be quite complex. Even determining what products fit into the regime can be quite complex at times. But what we love to do, like as an example, like wholesale clients, we've got the disclosure, like basically a disclosure disclaimer kind of thing, just saying that this is you being treated differently, and this is how you're treated differently, and these are, if you have issues, this is how they're dealt with in comparison to being in the regime. which I think is quite important. And we would really encourage businesses. Another thing in that, we don't think it's okay to just give somebody a document. So you should take file notes about that conversation, or even like we live in a different world now, you can record that conversation. If you're recording it, make sure that you stay on point and that you know exactly what you're talking about, because recordings can get you in trouble. Yes, but so I would say there, you just want to communicate clearly, communicate in writing, and then take a file note to back that up.
A really good point about that when you mentioned just about wholesale clients, I think we can expect an increasing focus on the business's integrity in using wholesale client status. And you picked up on a really good point, I think, Steve, which was about if you have got a wholesale client, it doesn't mean you've got no obligations. An expectation from a conduct side is actually explaining to those clients what it means to be a wholesale client. What are they missing out on? What are the consequences of the client being treated as wholesale? Because, of course, it is an option for any client at any point, even if they're wholesale, to say, actually, I want to be retail. Don't treat me as wholesale, and go down that route. Now, they can't. The question is whether they actually need to be told about that option. What would you recommend, Steve, to your clients? They tell their clients that you have the option of not being wholesale. And it's not a obligation, but
we think you definitely should. Without a doubt. And this is slightly off topic, but with wholesale clients, one of the things we often find is, going into your record keeping, are you using retail forms to deal with wholesale clients? Because a lot of times in your retail forms with a wholesale client, you have to contract to some type of service level. And a lot of times that's done the statement of advice. So a lot of people say we treat our wholesale clients as retail, and then they use a retail form, which, provides certain reviews and things like that. But then they say, oh no, they're wholesale, we don't have to do it. And you're saying, well, you do say you're going to do it. So be very careful in that space. But yes, we're big believers in providing as much information to the client as possible to make a decision, to give them the option, with however they want to approach it. Anything else from you there, David?
No, we're good. We better kick on.
Okay, yes. Level 5 CPD, if we can go on to the next slide, Haley. Yes, we had a couple of comments here, and there's been a number of questions and a bit of confusion in this space. One of the things we just wanted to mention is it's not a compliance exemption. So this is a competence exemption for a 2-year period. That applies to people who were in the regime previously. This is not a compliance exemption for FAPs. And there's a fair bit of nitty gritty that, as Mark would attest to, we're still even learning a little bit about as we go forward. But what you want to make sure is that as a director of the business, this is not a compliance exemption, it's a competence exemption. So you are still responsible to ensure that compliance over any advice type, over anybody that's come in from the old regime is adequate. Something that as directors of businesses, everybody says, oh, you've got 2 years. This is something you probably, if you do have a gap and you have a gap that has to be addressed, we would really suggest addressing it earlier rather than later. And if you've got a gap in expertise, that's something you have to consider from a compliance perspective. Something that's very important.
I think it's actually about exercising care, diligence, and skill, for which there is no transitional relief. That's something you've got to do now. If you're not competent, how can you be saying, well, I'm exercising care, diligence, and skill, right? The only relief is you don't have the prescribed requirements, right? So the obligations under the code, the prescribed bits don't apply, but you're still not allowed to be negligent. And that negligence includes actually being competent in what you're doing. So how are you confident, just from a general business side, actually, we know what we're doing? So it's not a complete get out of jail free card. It's just you don't need to meet the prescribed bits.
Yeah. And as directors, you have to understand that's going to be your responsibility. Having people in your business operate in that manner. So If you've got advisors in your business that need to update, we would really encourage you to get it done. And in that interim period, especially if they're inexperienced, you may want to put some additional supervision over them to make sure that they're meeting the requirements that you've set in place, and that provide you with comfort as a director. There's been a bit of confusion about the Closing the Gaps course. We do have some answers for you, and it's annoyingly a little bit murky. So in terms of in terms of moving forward, skills.org has mandated that advisors take upgrade from the first level 5 to the second level 5, or from the first level 5 that they do take the 31858 or Closing the Gaps. The FMA strongly recommends it, but it has not actually mandated it yet. There are some in the industry who think it will be mandated at a certain point. But if you have the new version 2, you do not need to go back and take it. That is built for this regime. You are safe. And that's something also you need to think about if you're the director of a FAP. Do you want them to take it? Do you want to go with skills and mandate it? This is something that you can own and put forward. Do you have any thoughts on that, David?
No, it's like I think there's going to be a further iteration to the code. I mean, the code itself is actually quite broad. It almost allows options there, and I'll come into that soon. But we should expect things will get cranked up. There will be more focus on it, and that's just as the way that it goes. I'm conscious also, Steve, that we have got a whole webinar session dedicated to the competency requirements in the end of June, and so we should probably through. So this is just a little taster to highlight the importance of getting your heads around that, and that we'll go into that in a bit more detail in a couple of months.
Yeah. And with this slide, I just wanted to mention, since I think there's been a lot of information out there about CPD, is think about it from a business perspective. It's not just about advisors. You know, you've got directors that are going to have an active regulator looking at you now, and directors have responsibilities. And then you've got support staff as well. So you want to be able to, whatever system you're going to use, you want to be able to evidence that people are receiving training, and that is something that you're tracking and reporting, and also obviously that the training is adequate, and providing capable support staff. But directors should consider the expertise for themselves as well, especially in bigger businesses. Very important to progress that. On to the next slide. When to apply for your license. I think there's a lot of you out there that are asking this question right now. We do know that the FMA has one that is through and approved, which is fantastic. What we'd say is apply when you're ready. So don't be in a rush. Don't kind of get halfway there and say, oh, we're just going to apply now. That's probably just going to create a very long process for you and might actually bring you more scrutiny with the FMA. Apply only when you're ready. Apply when you've got your policies operationalized. So it's one thing to write them, and then it's another thing to actually have your business operating in that manner. So consider those. There's various theories out there. You know, some say it's better to wait. Some big advocates on that. Some of you will have business aspirations that, you know, you want to get nominated reps, or, you know, you want to bring on people, and you think it's better to say, look, we're licensed, we're ready to go, than another group who's saying, oh, we're not actually licensed, we're going to get licensed later, and to have that certainty. So think about it from your business, but don't make a step before you're ready. Make sure your policies are operationalized, you formalize your governance, and do a skill assessment in your business. So make sure what you say you're doing, that you actually have the skills in your business and the resource in your business to move forward, and have a thought about your business structure. We're talking to a lot of businesses who said, this is what we're going to do. And now they're talking to another business, or they're thinking about doing other things. So make sure that you know your business structure is set in stone. You probably don't want to get halfway through the process and then have a significant change to your business structure, and you're more or less just starting all over again. Any thoughts from you, David?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Your first bullet point, spot on. When you are ready, it's not a case of let's think 15 March 2023 is not a target. That's not what you're aiming for. And in fact, actually, if you haven't got your full license application in by the end of 2022, you might be pushing your luck a bit, because if there's a problem with processing your application, you're rapidly going to run out of time before 15 March 2023. So don't treat it as a target. I think, go when you're ready. Make sure that you've got everything in place. It's certain. I am actually a bit of more of a believer in holding back a little bit to see what's actually happening. That there could be a danger that you rush into it before you've actually got your head around the full enormity of what is actually involved. And no, there's actually some providers that we're talking to us who are seriously questioning, thinking about, well, are we going to go through for a full license? I.e., we're going to see how this works in practice, and might say, you know what, we're going to abandon the financial advice game altogether. We're going to team up with another organization. Those options are all available to you. So there are some advantages in delaying a little bit, but there's also, as you mentioned, Steve, some couple of quite significant business advantages in getting your full license under your belt. Not only does it mean you don't have to worry about it, you just get on with the business of providing really good financial advice for your clients, but it opens up the door for, say, engaging interposed persons to, it just creates some more flexibility for your business of the way you want it to work. So I think the key thing is stepping back and say, well, how do I want my business to function in this new regime? Am I able to do it now under my transitional license? In which case, okay, it might not be so much urgency, work your way through it. If, however, your optimum model involves you wanting to put in place structures you can't technically do under a transitional license, then obviously you need to go early. But whatever you do not go before you are actually ready to go, and until you've actually got your policies, processes all nailed down, you're confident they work, and you can then apply with confidence and know that you can deliver what it is you're promising to the FMA that you will be delivering.
Yep. And if you're still, David brings up a good point about timing. If you're still, the FMA invariably, I think there was a transitional license that came through with only moments to spare. So make sure that as you're going through the process, you've got a project in place, especially if you have a bigger business. Say, these are our dates, this is when you're going to apply. And I would say, the FMA is expecting a lot of licenses at that 6-month mark. So, 6 to 9 months before that should be the end of your project, and where at the very latest, where you've submitted your application. Easily take that long. And I would be willing to bet with 6 months left, there's going to be a significant number of applications filed and a very grumpy FMA.
It's sort of was like a peak COVID type time where suddenly everything peaks at that time, and there might not be the hospital beds for you if you're part of that.
Exactly.
That way, so maybe. Excuse the analogy. One of the things that the FMA does have the power to bring forward the end date transition period for some providers. Have you heard anything, Steve or Mark, about any noises about whether that might be exercised? It is one of the key tools FMA has got to try and manage, I guess, smooth the curve by calling some to go early. Have you heard anything about that?
I had a chat with the FMA, and they are a bit stressed out about it. And they are a bit stressed out. We should be encouraging people to start with the process, and if they're ready to put their applications through. But what I suspect it'll be like is a bit like transitional licensing, where they're just going to use stronger language and put out a time as kind of if it's not in within 9 months, we won't guarantee you kind of thing. I suspect they'll do something along those lines. Legally, whether or not they can do that, they were still processing the transitional licenses that came through moments before, and people were getting them days after. So Yeah, I would say that they use strong language. Yeah, you know how.
My pick is it is actually it is another tool in the toolbox they have got. So if actually they've got concerns about your business, it is sort of something that an option that they have got to call for you to apply for that early. Might be a way that they try and manage that, and possibly looking at more complex businesses, maybe trying to get them to go earlier. I'm Mark.
Yeah.
So you've come off mute. Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. Their intention is not to use that tool, as far as I understand it. But I wouldn't be surprised if they don't get the flow that they're hoping for. They'll open that toolbox and see what they can do to speed things up. So at the moment, their goal is to encourage and to hope that they won't need to use it. They'll certainly have, as you suggest, Steve, the point where they'll announce a deadline and say, if you haven't applied by this date, we can't guarantee you'll get your full license in time. That'll certainly happen, but I suspect they'll watch the cards as they fall over the next 6 months and decide whether or not they need to do anything after that.
Yeah. And what I would suspect is they'll informally approach some of the bigger licensees and encourage them to start the process and engage with them specifically, the ones that they know will take a fair bit of scrutiny and a long time. Should we jump to the next slide on the FSPR? So just a quick piece on this. On the FSPR, for those of you that are going in, if you haven't added financial advisors, go in, add your financial advisors. You've got until the 15th of June. If you don't have it that day, I believe it's July 1st, they will do a run and your life will be very difficult moving forward. So make sure you get that done. Quite simple. For those of you that don't know or haven't been on, they've redone the FSPR. It's significant, and it's been done relatively well. These projects are massive and thankless, and people only talk about the things that go wrong. But it was a massive project for them. They've done a relatively good job with it. So be patient. It's not perfect. We've had some issues with it, but it's well on its way to being quite a good job. So as you go on, if you just click under your financial services, maintain financial services, the page that pops up, if you scroll down to about the midpoint, you can see here, you can add a financial advisor. When you click on that, you just get a little pop-up, ask you a couple of questions about the dispute scheme and that kind of thing. It takes about a minute. There is no confirmation, so you just go back, hit add financial advisor to the next one, and they're logged in on the system. Quite important, make sure you get that done. And for the financial advice provider, this little black box there. Whenever you're ready to hit it, go through, hit it, and then you just have to confirm and make some attestations, and you're into the new regime.
One tip suggestion there for all FAPs, just do recommend you do go on and just check your registration and just see what's there, because they do have the handy tips about confirmation pending of IE where you haven't updated, and there are some quite just fairly obvious flags that they do have in there because of the changes in terminology and processes. So you get a little tip there. Always, I think one of the regular things FAP should be doing is just checking, having a look at your registration and just making sure, does this actually still reflect the services you're doing? Are there actually any actions pending? If you think you've done something, actually just go in and check. Is it actually up to date? Does this reflect what I'm actually doing?
Yeah. And part of the issues we've seen, so everybody should be, and I would hope everybody on the call is initiated, at least adding financial advisors at this point. Part of the issues we've seen is advisors having accidentally registered themselves as a FAP. So then you have to make a couple phone calls. They've been pretty good about, the FMA has been pretty good. They get to it in a couple days, but they'll generally update that for you. And then there have been a couple of technical linking errors on the FSPR and some of the data they've had. So people have been unable to be added as a financial advisor. So definitely don't leave this till the end. If you haven't done it yet, do it immediately when we get off the call. Just make sure it literally takes a couple of minutes to add financial advisors. just to make sure you've not been registered wrong, or you don't have anything with your status. There is one or two technical points where MB FSPR learned that certain people tagged a certain way at a certain point in time haven't transitioned to, where they hadn't, and their status has changed. So just a very good thing to make sure. Don't leave it to the last moment. Yep. And if we pop onto the new slide, the next slide, writing your business's policies. This is probably something that's very new to the vast majority of the transitional licensees. Some of the bigger entities, and we've got some on the call, they're going to have a lot of experience having either worked in banks or larger institutions in a formalized governance function that understand how policies work and what they look like, and understand how to read them and implement them and what additional documents you need. The vast majority of you, this is new. And that is, I use the analogy, Michael missed his first jump shot. People doing things for the first time ever generally don't do things well. It comes with practice, training, and repetition. So if you're doing this for the first time, there are various templates out there. We would certainly encourage you to not try to write them without a template of some sort. So work your way through a set of templates. There's a number of them out there. There's product providers that have provided some. There's groups like us. Sure, David would be happy to work through them with you.
Yeah, you don't really want to get your lawyers too heavily involved. No, they've got to make sense.
I wasn't going to say, maybe better a checking function afterwards. Yes, so in terms of a policy, you want to make sure that you've gone through, you understand the FMA and its questioning. They're quite basic. They want to know when it was approved, when it will be reviewed. So you want to make sure you've got those. That can be as part of a whole manual, or depending on the maturity and size of your business. Generally, it's going to talk about kind of what's the actual policy, who's responsible, related documents to that policy, and then have some additional information. Some of them can be quite high level. We read some and we say, well, this doesn't tell us a thing in terms of what actually happens as an operational point, and smaller businesses should really avoid that. But so you're just going to go through, like I said, find some templates if you're doing it for the first time, certainly, and keep it simple. Tailor it to your business, tailor it to your skill sets. We talk to a lot of businesses and they say, oh, we're going to do this. And you say, okay, who's going to do it? And how are they going to do it? And they don't have answers for that. They just say, we're going to do it. So think about what people in your business do now, look at their job descriptions and say, okay, what gives them the capability to actually do this? What we often see is somebody who has no experience being a key support person, and they say, oh, she or he is going to do all this work. And you're looking at them saying, don't they already have a full-time job? And the answer is, oh yeah, they'll just figure it out and do it. So something for you to certainly consider. Keep it simple and keep it to your business. Hit minimum standards. Don't be aspirational. We see that all the time. Oh, we're going to do this. Prove after a couple of years that if you hit the minimum standard, that then be aspirational. But you'll get in trouble. What you say is aspirational all of a sudden becomes the minimum bar. Yes. Thoughts from you, David?
Yeah, no, really funny. I think practically the licensing guide, I said it earlier, has a really good set of the essential policies that you need. So that provides an outline as a FAP. It's not the exclusive set, but that sets out, I guess, a good guidance as to these are all the policies and processes that we do need in order to function as a FAP. You'll need to wrap some more around those that make sense for your business, but that provides a good starting point. I'm conscious, Steve, we've only got about 10 minutes left, so maybe I'll keep quiet now and let you just run through the rest of the slides and we get to them, right?
Okay, we've got 3 or 4. We should be able to cover that in 10 minutes. I did want to make sure, just mention one thing in this is, as directors, make sure if it's not directors creating the slides, that you do have the directors approve them. That's quite important. The directors need to have visibility and approve them. It's not just a kind of give it to a junior person and off they go. The directors need to own them. Yes. So moving on to the next piece in terms of governance. As we said in the last slide, keep it simple, an appropriate size for your business. And that's the hard thing about this guide, is that it's functionally looking at anything from a one-man band to potentially hundreds, many thousands even, of advisors. So it's really hard looking at the guide to say, how robust does this have to be for a small business as opposed to a much larger business? We talked about this in the last one. Don't overpromise. Don't get aspirational. We see lots of people wanting to do lots of amazing things. And we look at it and we say, you're adding no more resource. You're not increasing the budget for certain areas. You haven't even accounted for additional training. You're having people do this that have never done this before. Don't set the bar higher than you need to. Find a minimum standard. Prove you can meet the minimum standards. This isn't the kind of thing where you get points for going way up. You know, prove you can meet the minimum standard as you run your business. Really important. And we can't emphasize that enough. We've touched on this before as well. Consider the education and skills for directors. This is a regime that you're going to have an active regulator as a director. And some of the the class one businesses, that can be quite simple. But as you get into some of the bigger businesses, you've got multiple advisors, you might have advisory boards. You need to know that you're being productive, and you need to know that you're adding value to your business. And it's great. You should consider all of those things. But, part of this is maturing the director's capabilities and making sure they're fit for purpose. So you want to spend some time thinking about, and there aren't a lot of resources out there right now. The IOD for a lot of businesses is probably too big of a fish for a lot of businesses, but there are resources coming. So as those resources come, think about how they fit into your business, think about how they impact your directors. And there is advisory boards that can be a very efficient way. And assess the skills and capability of the people doing the work in your business. It's not okay to just say, oh, we're going to give somebody a full-time job, 25% of a job. And that's going to be one of those director assessments. So the FMA will look at that if it falls down and say, well, this person was doing a full-time job, or you've not allocated any more training, any more resource, and you've given them 25% more of a job. So that's not them failing, that's you failing as a director. So you need to think about that. And it must be your top priority. Staying licensed and remaining licensed or getting your license and then remaining your license is going to be, if you lose your license, you are going to lose the inherent value in your business. If you lose your license, you're not going to be paid. Product providers are very unlikely to pay somebody who's lost their license. So you will, even somebody buying a book of a group that's lost their license, think about it from the economic perspective. That can be very difficult. And make sure that you're evidencing that you're focused on good customer outcomes. This has to be a top priority as well. And that integrates a lot into record keeping and the time and effort you're putting into building these systems. As we move across to the next slide, managing your compliance assurance program. So as a director, do you understand your obligations? First off, if you don't understand, you're probably going to struggle to implement compliance assurance in your business. And how are you assigning tasks? How are you testing? How does the reporting work? How does the record keeping on that work? You can't just say, oh yes, we tested those, and have it be a trust exercise. You need to make sure you're integrating that into those policies. And how is that actually being reported to the director? If somebody does that, and as a director, you've put off the last 2 meetings and it never gets to you, and there's no evidence of you having ever received it, that's going to come down on you. It's not going to come down on the people below you. And you're not going to be able to push it down. This is something you're going to have to understand. You need to be able to have very specific tasks. One of the things we hate to see is, oh, we'll do periodic testing. To me, periodic testing is a busy person looks at that and says, not today. And that happens for a lot of days until somebody forces you to do it or somebody calls you up on it. Even that reporting, you need to understand, when is it reported? How is it reported? Who has visibility? Very important for your business. And your compliance assurance program, this is going to be outline everything you do in your business as a director to make sure you understand what's happening in your business, but it's a living document. And you're going to want to update that testing. You're going to want to update risk assessments. And for some of you, that's a very foreign concept. But as directors, you need to assess your business and say what's adding value, what's not. You may get to a point where you say, yes, we're doing this testing. It turns out perfect every time. So A, is the test a good test? And then B, should you move the resource elsewhere? We will jump in to the next slide. David, do you want to talk through this one for a minute?
Yeah, I think responsibilities. I think, look, and there's, I guess, a few tips there of what you should do. And what we should have said, I guess, with this slide is actually all the things on the left-hand side as you're looking at it, multiple director businesses probably also do apply for the class for the other side of the one director side. But there's just a few, I guess, tips around your responsibilities, what you should be looking at, sort of going over. I think probably in the interest of time, we should just bounce through it and jump on to the next one.
Yep. The next one is a summary. So we are kicking through the slides quite quickly. In terms of the directors, I was just going to touch on one thing. Even if you're a small business, have some type of formalized function. Whether or not you just call it a director meeting, and you do that a couple of times a year just to check in and track what you're doing. And make sure you do have an agenda. There's nothing wrong with it. Like I said, a lot of this is great business practice, even for non-financial advisor businesses, non-FAPs. So build that in. Class 1 businesses, your locum is more complicated than you think, especially if you have employees and you need to pay people and you've got different systems. So run through that. But we'll jump into the summary.
Steve, just on that point, I just have a little notebook like this that I've labeled governance and have my agenda on the inside cover and write my notes each quarter when I sit down for my my governance meeting, scan them and just put it to the cloud. It's my record.
Yeah. You don't need to feel silly having a meeting with yourself and recording a conversation. So long as you don't have too many sort of heated debates with yourself that you're recording.
Yeah.
Right? You don't need to feel the need to make, but just record. It's almost like, well, it's not a meeting, just having a process where you're just documenting and recording the stuff that would have been covered in a meeting had there been more than one of you. And just you go through that. It's just a disciplined process of recording, right? I'm thinking about the business, spending some time on the business instead of in the business. As a director, you just make a note of it, right? I've looked at these key things, run my agenda, bang, move on, and just go through that, get into that practice. I think is really good.
And that's why the agenda is so important, because you're covering a range of things. You're thinking about your risks in your business as well as your operational success, how your finances are looking. Your compliance, is everything on track? So just making sure that you do all of those things covered there.
And don't just treat it as a tick box, bang, 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 5-minute job that you do over a coffee. You just actually step down and just turn your mind to each of your agenda items, key things, and just record. Yep, I thought about that. We're good because, and put your reason behind it. So don't just put a tick. You say, well, I think this is still good because, and just say, well, why? Why do you think you're in good shape?
Yeah. And anybody with a higher level of risk and governance experience has seen tick boxes ticked for months and quarters and probably years where nobody put any thought into it. And then it does come to bite you in the bum later. It eventually catches up to you if you're just going through blindly ticking things to say I ticked them. But in the time. As a summary, I'll take the first 2 points, then maybe David can take the second two. Just keep it simple and right size it for your business. There's no, you have different skill sets in your business. All businesses are different, but keep it as simple as possible for your business and make it right for your business. So don't get aspirational. Don't look at what your neighbors are doing and say, oh, they're doing that, I'm going to do that. We saw a lot of that with disclosure. We had people that actually had good disclosure statements that made them offside because their neighbor did something. So just focus on what you're doing with your business and make it right for the skills in your business, and apply when you're ready. Definitely wait until you're ready.
Yep, apply when you're ready, but don't wait until you're ready to actually have everything in place. You need to do these things now. So get all these processes, use your licensing application guide as your Bible, something you're actually reading off. Am I actually in place now to deliver on that? Doesn't mean you need to apply, but actually you should have everything in place. Stress test it, make sure it's actually functioning for you. So the regime is fully in force now. You've just got a bit of relief before you need to apply for a full license, but all the obligations apply now. So you should have the systems in place to support what you would need to apply for your full license, because they're just as relevant now. Applying, whilst there's a bit to it, is actually the easy part. It's putting in place everything that's required. That's where the fun part happens, and where all the work's required, where you might need to look to the likes of Steve, Compliance Refinery, to assist you getting everything in order to make sure that it's working. Don't be afraid to reach out to experts to just stress test, look at, is everything functioning properly? Am I good to go? Are there any improvements I can make? And bear in mind, it's going to be an evolutionary process. Probably actually what you're doing today, probably the only certainty, even if you're good, is you're going to be doing more stuff, more things next year, because we will constantly learn. It's going to be constant improvement. Just make sure, as Steve said before, you're getting over the bar initially in time, and then look at improving, because every business is just going to keep improving as our knowledge improves, as we've got more experience of this new regime.
Well, thank you both. It's really important, as you say, to kind of get this stuff into your business practices now. Take that full licensing guide and chunk it up and do one piece at a time. How do I meet these particular requirements? And really dig into them. It's not just a yes or no answer. It's how do I meet these requirements? And if you've got the skills and capability to do that, to chunk it up and to do sort of one section a week or something over the next few months, then you'll be in good stead. You can review the past webinars that we've got here to give you some assistance. If you really don't know where to start, reach out for help. You come to one of these compliance advisors or something like that and say, look, I just don't know where to start. And you'll get a good starting point from them. Then you can go away and do some homework and then come back and get your final work reviewed. I would recommend that for anybody. So if you've got all your processes and things in place and you've been through that guide thoroughly and you think, okay, I understand how I meet these requirements, get a review before you go in and apply for that full license. But do start now. The sooner you start, the sooner you can apply for that full license and the better off you're going to be. So thank you very much, David and Steve, for your time this morning. If we can hop on to the next slide, we've got, as I said, these webinars will be monthly over the rest of the year. These are the topics that we've got that we're planning to cover. A compliance advice process is going to be the next one. Then we're working through education obligations, the customer experience, another session on business continuity plans and cybersecurity, a bit on financial management. So making sure that your business has the money on an ongoing basis. You're planning your ebbs and flows, those sorts of things to be a robust going concern. And then a session on designing and implementing your compliance framework. So that's what we've got planned. If you've got interest in other topics that aren't covered, please feel free to submit them through to us. This stuff is not set in stone. We are flexible on this, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. The next slide is just a couple of links. So you'll be able to download these slides. There's no need to take note of these now. And we've added these in kind of, it's not for you to read and see them now, but to know that they're there. There's a link to the Professional Advice Hub, which is a good starting point for the information that's available. And then links to the standard conditions and the introductory guide for full license requirements that have been talked about today. Just note that that introductory guide to full license requirements does change periodically. It is, as I think David pointed out to me, I think it was David Greenstad actually, that it's now up to version 3. and that version 3 was released a couple of weeks ago, and it has got some significant differences to version 2. So do check periodically and make sure that you're downloading the latest version. So take a look at those links, and I'll hope to see you at the next webinar. Thank you very much for coming. Spread the word. We'd love to be to be able to help as many people as possible with these webinars, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. And again, thank you to Steve and David.